Every time I would come across a description of Clara Schumann's life, there would be two more names closely associated with her, and that is of Robert Schumann and Johannes Brahms. It is almost like a trinity of names that while you inquire about Clara, the other two would always come up. The reason is, of course, that these are two incredibly famous and important composers, with Robert being Clara's husband and Brahms being infatuated with Clara throughout his entire life and their intense and at times romantic friendship. But in posterity, Clara became kind of a footnote when discussing these three artists, whereas in their lifetime, and especially at the time of their first meeting, she was the superstar in whose orbit both of those men existed. So in this video, I'd like to talk about Clara's life before her marriage to Robert and how she became one of the most famous and respected artists of the 19th century. So Clara's maiden name was Wieck, Clara Wieck, and this was the name she first became famous with. She was a virtuoso child prodigy. Now, contrary to some popular belief, music prodigies are not just born, they're made in most cases by their parents. Acknowledging this fact doesn't take away from their genius, but we can take examples of Mozart and his father, or Beethoven and his father. It was the parent who was the first teacher, the first impresario, the person not only guiding their genius child, but in some cases exploiting their talent to their benefit. And in Clara's case, her father was just such a man, highly ambitious and clever music teacher who made it his mission to make Clara into a virtuoso. So who were Clara's parents? Her father, Friedrich Wieck, was a very driven music teacher who married one of his students, Clara's mother, Marianne Tromlitz, who herself was incredibly talented musician, soprano and pianist. Friedrich used Marianne sort of as his business card. Her every performance would raise his prestige as a music teacher. She was expected to practice, perform, manage the household, and she gave birth to 5 children, 4 of whom survived, with Clara being the oldest. Clara's parents' marriage lasted 8 years and ended up in divorce, which was very unusual at the time. The law considered children the property of the father, and Friedrich allowed for Clara to stay with her mother until the age of 5, after which she was taken from her mother, and you can really say that this was the end of her childhood. So at 5 years old, Clara found herself living in a motherless household with a father who now turned all of his ambition into his children. Clara turned out to be not only the one with superior musical gifts, but she was also the only one who could withstand and cope with her father's strict teaching methods. He essentially supervised every waking hour of her day. At 7 years old, Friedrich started Clara's diary, which he would check and make notes in. And we know quite a bit not only about her early years at the piano, but also details of the business correspondence between her father and concert presenters, as she had to copy his letters into her diary. By the age of 7, she would spend 3 hours at the piano daily, 1 hour on a lesson and 2 on practicing. She took hours-long daily walks with her father, who believed that the best way to develop physical strength is through walking. And she had private tutors for school subjects, languages, music theory, harmony, and composition with leading teachers in Leipzig. At 9 years old, she made her official public appearance at the Gewandhaus with a terrific review of the performance, which of course greatly pleased her father. Clara charmed everyone, and Friedrich was able to show off his success as a teacher and make important connections for the future. Soon after, Clara was invited to play at the prominent salons in Berlin and Vienna. Aristocratic ladies were showering her with gifts, and on their trip to Weimar, she played for Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who gave her a medal with his portrait and inscription, "For the gifted artist Clara Wieck." As Clara was becoming more famous and her father's reputation as teacher was growing greater, a young law student and aspiring musician by the name of Robert Schumann met Friedrich Wieck at one of his friends' music salon and was so impressed by Clara's skill at the piano and her musicality that he applied to study with Wieck. In turn, Friedrich promised in a letter to Robert's mother that in 3 years he will turn him, quote, into one of the greatest pianists now living. So in the fall of 1830, Robert moved into their house to receive daily instructions from Wieck. Clara was 11 and Robert was 20 years old. Their personalities could not be more different. Clara's life was so structured and carefully planned by her father. She was a serious and mature musician by the age of 12-13, and there was very little childhood experience in her life. Robert, on the other hand, was a free spirit. He studied law at the university, but he was in love with the arts and literature. He was a dreamer. So having this young aspiring artist living in her house gave her a glimpse of those childhood experiences she never had. Robert would actually play with her and her brothers, scare them with ghost stories, and show them those simple, joyful ways of being a child. Unfortunately, Robert's dreams of concert stage were squashed because of the hand injury. So he eventually had to give up the idea of becoming a virtuoso and turn to literary work as a music critic and to composition. When his Variations Papillons Opus 2 were published, he sent a copy to Friedrich, who found it very original and gave it to Clara to learn. Robert was relying on his young friend to play his music. He even wrote to her, lamenting his own hand injury, quote, "Now you are my right hand. You must take care of yourself that nothing happens to you." So how did their friendship evolve? Well, with Robert being older, he of course had more experiences. He was basically falling in love with all the pretty young women he met. He was briefly engaged to one of Friedrich's students, which was something that bothered Clara. But Clara was extraordinary and of course stood out from the rest. Their first kiss happened shortly after Clara's 16th birthday. There was a celebration with champagne, dinner, dancing, and music making. Felix Mendelssohn, one of her close friends, was there and they played music for each other. And afterwards, she wrote to Robert, quote, "When you gave me that first kiss, I thought I would faint. Everything went blank and I could barely hold the lamp that was lighting your way out." The young lovers were quite naive about the future, hoping for Friedrich's blessing. But when Clara's father suspected any romantic inclinations, he got furious. He sent Clara away to stay with friends in Dresden. He threatened to shoot Robert and for the following 2 years was doing everything possible to divide them. He forced Clara to send back all his letters. He scheduled a long concert tour for her, during which for 18 months they had no communication except that he still allowed Clara to include Robert's music into her programs. Clara was determined to marry Robert. When she returned to Leipzig after another tour, she scheduled Robert's symphonic etudes on the program and through friends arranged to send him a letter after 18 months of silence. Robert wrote in his diary, quote, "A union for eternity." That was August 14, 1837, and this was the date that both of them considered their betrothal. Through their mutual friends, Robert arranged an official interview with Friedrich to ask for Clara's hand, and that was a disaster. Friedrich humiliated him, accused him of all sorts of things, including being interested in money at the root of his proposal, and this was the beginning of the long confrontation ahead. Clara, at 18, was determined to marry Robert, but she was also dependent on her father. For all his faults and tyrannical qualities, I think it is important to remember that his ambitions and dreams for his daughter made her into the musician she became. And his attitudes were unprecedented for a middle-class parent of a girl. At the time, it was expected for women to play some piano to amuse their husbands. But with Clara, he envisioned her as a musician, a great performer and a composer. He would often quote Goethe with pride, quote, "She plays with as much strength as 6 boys." And indeed, this is who she became under his tutelage. She was honored by musicians and royalty. Publishers were fighting to get the rights to publish her works. In the minds of the audiences, she was a piano queen. In Vienna, there was even a dessert named after her, Tort à la Wieck. Friedrich's fears about Robert were not unfounded. He respected him as a writer and a composer, thought him a genius really, but he doubted he could provide Clara with the life she deserved. Some of those fears he transferred to Clara, who at times in her letters to Robert would call him naive, saying to him that while you are at a cafe at 10 o'clock in the evening or going home, I'm just arriving to a party where I have to play and work. She was at times doubtful about how secure their financial situation would be. She did not want a lavish life, no horses or diamonds in her own words, but she wanted to live a life free of care, and was asking Robert to think if he could provide that for her, and she could be happy by always working with her art. Despite those doubts, they were pursuing their plans for marriage, and they legally needed Friedrich's consent for this, which of course he refused to give. So they had to go to court, and that was a terrible blow to Clara to see her father behave so monstrously. Not only did Friedrich send an 11-page letter to the court slandering Robert, he would go as far as send letters to the cities where Clara was about to perform, warnings that she either was not well to play or that she would ruin any piano she touches. Just really an awful betrayal of her love and trust in him as a parent. But the court eventually ruled in their favor, and on September 12, 1840, they got married. Clara wrote in her diary that it was, quote, the happiest day of my life. My entire being was filled with thanks to him who has finally brought us to one another over so many barriers and chasms. So this is where I'm leaving the story for now. Clara as a young, brilliant woman in love with her husband and looking ahead for a hopeful, happy future together.